Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. Sugi, we talked with Margot Livesey about the spy novel as a beach read on our last episode, but do you remember our last episodes? I'm starting to have this thing where I'm like not sure that I know what we've actually recorded and what we haven't, but I do remember that we had Margot on last week, and we did
had
talk
Margot
about
on,
spy.
and she mentioned John le Carré, and she did talk about sitting on the beach. I mean, my mind is a sieve, but I have retained that that fact.
Today, we're going to talk about real, if perhaps lesser known, spies and the CIA. Do you have any favorite spy movies?
I mean, I really liked all the Daniel Craig Bond movies. I thought Skyfall was really good, but I mean, honestly, I still have a soft spot for Austin Powers.
I can't watch Austin Powers because when I go to the parental guidelines for Austin Powers to see if I can watch it with my kids, they're like, no, you can't. And
really?
Well, too much sex, I think, maybe for a 10-year-old.
I guess that makes sense. Liz Hurley is in that movie.
Plus, my kids are not into spies. They're into superheroes. It's a whole different ballgame. Anyway, my favorite movie is The Constant Gardener, which is from a Jean le Carré novel, and is the kind of movie that my kids would be totally bored by.
That's a gorgeous, gorgeous movie. And I feel like gets at so much of the existential plight of people living double lives like that.
Yeah. Anyway, the idea of American intelligence agencies seems like an oxymoron today because our president routinely ignores and discredits the findings of our various spies and spy masters, calling them agents of the deep state, or he's busy sending them off on wild goose chases to dig up intelligence on his political opponents or trying to make them do that. But like it or not, spies, politics, and power have gone together as long as the nation state has existed, if not before. And later in the show, we're going to be joined by fiction writer Andrew Altschul.
As Americans interfere all over the world, that is also part of how Americans are perceived all over the world. And Andrew Altschul's new novel, The Gringa, takes inspiration from the real-life case of Laurie Berenson. He'll be talking more about that novel later in the show. First, we're very happy to welcome veteran war correspondent, best-selling author, and journalist Scott Anderson. Scott is the author of novels Triage and Moonlight Hotel, as well as nonfiction works The Man Who Tried to Save the World, War Zones, Lawrence in Arabia, and Fractured Lands. His newest book is The Quiet Americans, 4 CIA Spies at the Dawn of the Cold War, a tragedy in 3 acts. Scott's work has frequented the New York Times, GQ, Esquire, and Vanity Fair. He currently lives in Fleischman's, New York, and was a classmate of Witt's at the Iowa Writers Workshop. Scott, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
It's good to see you, buddy. How you doing up there?
Real good. How about you?
I'm fine. We were just saying you're on the shelf here. This is my nonfiction area. I don't have a hard. Go ahead.
No, I thought for sure you just put them up there for show for me.
That's true. I had to rush out and buy all of your books and put them in the shelf to get this thing set up. All right. So we're pointing out that we've known each other for a long time, since the early 90s in Iowa. But I have never talked to you about your dad, who appears in the preface of The Quiet Americans. He was what you call a yellow dog Democrat from Fresno, California, who worked for USAID in South Korea and Taiwan in the 60s. Which was a time when those countries were run by dictators backed by the U.S., as you say. Right. Could you tell us his story and maybe explain why you started the book with him?
Yeah, he was, I described him as a yellow dog Democrat. He was from this ranching family in Fresno, California. As soon as he could get overseas, at the age of 18, he just took off. He wanted to get the hell out of Fresno. And weirdly enough, he ends up at Pearl Harbor in 1941 on a Navy. He was a civilian, but he was working on a Navy contract, building, ironically enough, underground gasoline storage tanks in case of an air attack. So he was on this hill directly above Pearl Harbor when the whole thing happened.
Oh
he joined the Navy. He fought throughout World War II. Right afterwards, he joined the Agency for International Development. He wanted to get back overseas. So his first few years in late 40s, early 50s, he was mostly in South America, Central America. And then right around, I guess, about 1959, he moves over to Asia. And so I grew up in in Asia, in Korea and Taiwan and Indonesia.
So what was it about his life, though, like that you feel like, other than the fact that obviously there's some sort of foreign travel gene in the Anderson family, because
Right.
your brother, of course, also writes about foreign places, but you know, what about his story made him feel like the proper introduction to this story of these four spies that we're going to be talking about?
Well, I think I've always felt my father was caught in this kind of dichotomy. I mean, as I said, he was very liberal. Part of the work he was doing in these countries was doing agrarian reform, breaking up these large land holdings and distributing land to the peasants. And so this was a big move in the late 50s and early 60s in third world countries. And yet at the same time, he was part of the apparatus keeping these military dictatorships in place. So along with the kind of soft power hearts and minds work he was doing, like agrarian reform, he was also setting up rural vigilante organizations that were designed to keep an eye on the local population and to report any kind of red tendencies, among the local population. And I think I know that it really, as time went on, that part of his work really bothered him. Taiwan, where I spent my formative years, was a really severe military dictatorship. Chiang Kai-shek ruled under an official state of siege. So anyone steps out of line at all, and they were gone into the prisons. And so I think that, over time, that really had a corrosive effect on him. We moved back to the States right at the end of the 1960s. And my father used to drag me and my siblings to anti-war demonstrations down on the Washington Mall. And he always told my brother and I, my brother was 2 years older, that if we were still, if Vietnam was still going on when we came of draft age, he was going to take us to Canada. So, and then as soon as he was able to, as soon as he turned 50, he quit the government. And I think he just got sickened out by some of the stuff he'd been doing over the years.
Well, your book about T. Lawrence focused on a person who'd been a media sensation during his life and after, and The Quiet Americans chronicles the lives of these four spies: Frank Wisner, Michael Burke, Peter Sichel, and Edward Lansdale. Am I saying that right?
Sichel, yeah.
Sichel.
Yeah.
Wisner and Lansdale are known to students of the CIA, but none are what I would necessarily say, they're not household names today. So how did you pick those four men to profile? Was the book always structured around their lives, or did you come to them through research?
It came to them through research. And the funny thing is, so once I decided the parameters of what the period I wanted to write about, which is essentially 1944 to 1956. So it's this formative years of the early Cold War. It was kind of a treasure hunt. I wanted to find, and I chose spies because really spies were the people at the front line of the Cold War. I didn't want to write a history of diplomats or generals sitting behind desks. I wanted to talk about people who were directly affected and in the so-called front lines of this struggle. And so I naturally came to spies. So yes, you mentioned Frank Wisner and Ed Lansdale. They, among people who know the early Cold War period, they're fairly well known. But so with this parameter I had, I wanted people who were out in the field doing cool stuff, and also that left a paper trail behind. Some documentary evidence that I could kind of build out their story, whether it was letters in archives or government documents. So I probably ended up looking at about 20 to 25 different people and really with just those kind of basic parameters in line. And I imagined that at the end of it, I would have, maybe 10 people to choose from. And as it turned out, I had exactly 4. It was, I did not have a 5th person for this book. It was only going to be these 4 men because, I came across some people doing really interesting things for a few years. And then all of a sudden they joined the State Department and were stamping visas at the embassy in Paris. So I was kind of stuck with these 4.
You call the book a tragedy in 3 acts, and we're going to talk about the tragedy part later. But the opening is kind of boisterous. Before people screw things up or and run into the sort of contradictions that you're writing about. But and maybe even romantic, as long as you forget what the CIA would eventually sort of become, which, to be fair, you don't. But to give us a sense of the early part of the book, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the backstory of one of the spies featured here, who I did not know anything about, Michael Burke, and read us a section about his brush with Hollywood.
Sure. As a preface to him, I'll say early on, I described Michael Burke as James Bond before James Bond existed. He was just he had this crazy, crazy life full of highs and lows. And I'll tell you about one of the highs here. It starts out low. Incredibly handsome. People who knew him describe him as the most charming man they'd ever met. And he really did have this sort of existence of the CIA that we cinematically imagine. Much more James Bond than John le Carré, for instance. I mean, it was really very colorful.
Not a George Smiley type.
Not a George Smiley type, no. So the section I'm going to read is just after the end of World War II. He had been a commando during World War II, was parachuted behind enemy lines, had all kinds of crazy adventures. And this is when he's just come back to the United States. He's in New York. As he drank whiskey and soda at the Pierre Hotel, Burke saw that all of this was gone forever. Taking its place was a sad remembrance of all else he had lost in the war: his brother, a number of comrades in arms, and just hours earlier, his marriage. Finally paying his bar bill, he stumbled out to the street. Where now, I asked myself. I had no answer but to board a double-decked Fifth Avenue bus, climb to an empty wooden bench at the rear of the open topside, and ride to Washington Square and back again in the mild September twilight. At the moment, survival in civilian life was my most ambitious hope. I hadn't a clue where to begin, but some inner voice, impatient with my mood, told me I could not ride the Fifth Avenue bus forever. When at last Burke returned to his bleached lodgings at the University of Pennsylvania Club that night, he found a telephone message waiting for him. It was from a former OSS comrade named Corey Ford, and he wanted Burke to call him back. A writer best known for his satirical essays in the 1930s, Corey Ford had joined the OSS in 1943, and he and Burke became friends during their wartime postings in London. Helping cement that friendship was Ford's helpful advice after Burke had confided his own vague aspirations of becoming a writer. By September 1945, Ford had co-authored a recently released sensationalized history of OSS entitled Cloak and Dagger. Where Burke came into the picture, Ford explained on the phone, was that Warner Brothers had just bought rights to Cloak and Dagger, and they needed a technical advisor to help with the script. Recalling his friend's interest in writing, Ford wondered if Burke might be the man for the job. Oh, and along with a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel, the one-month gig paid $600 a week, which was not only 12 times the average American income, but exactly $600 a week more than Burke was currently earning. Any interest, Ford asked? In less than 48 hours, Michael Burke had wrapped up his commitments in New York and climbed aboard the Super Chief luxury train for the 5-day journey to Los Angeles. While there are many variations of the American dream, within weeks, Burke was living its particularly pleasant Southern California version, driving around in a convertible sports car, being paid large sums of money for no discernible reason, drinking cocktails on the beach with Hollywood celebrities. He was out in Hollywood for a couple of years. That all went bust. Burke moved to New York. He wanted to make it as a writer. That was a disaster. He tried all kinds of different writing.
I did feel bad for him about all those films that didn't make. I was like, I know what that feels like, kind of.
Yeah, I know. We've all been there, right?
I'm fascinated by the way that Hollywood, which is, this land of fiction, is so hungry to eat up and sell the quote unquote real life experience of a man like Michael Burke. And your title obviously refers to Graham Greene's novel. And there are plenty of references in the book to films and literature about spies, which is this whole genre. And Tenet is out this week. And we all grew up watching movies about the untouchable and enigmatic James Bond, which we've already talked about, or reading John le Carré or laughing at Austin Powers. So just how much did the American love of spies protect and empower the characters in The Quiet Americans, and you think also the CIA itself? Like, how does the CIA weaponize that?
I think I'm not sure that that obsession with spies. I've thought a lot about this. I mean, maybe you see it more in the United States because of movies and things, but I think it's almost people have a natural fascination with it, and I think it's two things. It's the idea of having a double life, having a secret life, and also operating outside of the system. You get to, you're living by your wits. You're kind of making things up as you go along. I think so. I think that's I think that's almost a universal fascination with that. The interesting thing, I remember reading this years ago about how the mafia got a lot of its dressing tips and stuff from watching the Godfather movies, and I think that I think there's something with the CIA about that too. That the whole idea of life imitating art. So the fact is, the one man of the four that I write about who's still alive, Peter Sichel, he's 98 years old. He said that there were long periods of tedium, and in fact, the act of having a double life, and is incredibly alienating. You can't tell. I think his wife knew what he was doing, but she certainly didn't know the details, and his friends didn't know at all.
How do you think about the tragedy in the end for your quartet of spies, and how is it, in your opinion, that they don't find something to be for, or that they're so horribly for the wrong thing?
What you see when the Eisenhower administration comes in 52 is that whatever sort of idealism that you saw 6-7 years earlier is gone. And now, FDR in 1944 was talking about the end of World War II was going to be the end of the colonial empires. America was going to be this herald of democracy around the world, in the developing world. And then a decade later, now America's overthrowing democratic regimes in Guatemala and Iran. And America is propping up colonial regimes throughout Asia and Africa. So the policy had completely changed. And I think what happened to these men individually, I talked about Burke earlier. Burke was in charge of all these infiltration operations, of dropping anti-communist partisans behind the Iron Curtain. He dispatched hundreds, probably 100, maybe even low thousands of men across the line. And all these operations were disasters. The KGB knew these guys were coming from the get-go, and virtually all of them were rounded up and either executed or thrown into the gulags. So he became quite disillusioned. Peter Sichel, I think for rather similar reasons. He just saw this futility in the way the war was being waged. What was also happening at the same time was the Red Scare was happening domestically in the US. And all these men were actually politically quite liberal, certainly very socially liberal. And they saw Joseph McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover, who were leading the Red Scare, not only as fools, but also incredibly injurious to the American prestige overseas. And one of the great ironies of the story is that two of the four men I write about ended up, Peter Sichel and Frank Wisner, both ended up being investigated by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI as potential communist spies. So I think the disillusionment came, it kind of came with the territory. Two of the men I write about ended up quitting the CIA, Michael Burke and Peter Sichel. Frank Wisner ended up committing suicide. I mean, he suffered from mental illness, but what seemed to precipitate the mental illness was his work with the CIA. And really only one, Ed Lansdale, stayed in for a while, then even he left.
So this time period that you cover in The Quiet Americans from 1944 to 1956 was a while ago, but we're also sort of these days painfully aware of our current president's fondness for authoritarian Stalin-like figures, Putin, Kim Jong-il, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. And I wondered if we could talk to, bringing this back to the present day, is there a connection between this coddling of dictators that Trump sort of likes to do publicly and the way that the United States worked with dictatorships as in this during the time period that you're writing about?
I think there's a small thread. I think that what happened. I think what happened with the CIA and with the American foreign policy in general in the 40s and 50s, and well into the 60s, and the time that I was a kid growing up, is that there was such an incredible tumble of events. There were crises happening, every other day, especially in the early days of the Cold War, that they went the path of expedience. It's like, okay, I'm sure they,
as long as it's not communist, we don't care. Like, it just doesn't matter,
Right, and we can't like play around with the idea of like, oh, maybe if we get rid of this dictator, the Democrats will take over and it'll be a parliamentary democracy. It's like, stick with what works, essentially. But where I see a real change with the current regime here is that what you have now, what you've never ever had before, is a president who has kind of made common ground with this Russian system. People I've talked to within the CIA, all of them, to man and woman, they all see Russia, especially Vladimir Putin's Russia, as an adversarial nation. Is not a friend of the United States, and they are both deeply concerned and deeply suspicious of why we have a president who seems to so steadfastly not acknowledge that.
You had your own run-ins with Putin, as I recall.
Yeah.
I think, talking about getting back in and out of the game. So this was in 2009. This was like a year before I borrowed your body armor and went to Iraq. And I think when you gave me your body armor, you were like, "I'm done with this." I wonder if this article had anything to do with that. But you wrote a 2009 GQ article on Putin's role in Russia's apartment bombings, which were a big deal at the time.
Right.
And then that got, what was it? Condé Nast was going to not run it in Russia.
Yeah.
Because
they didn't run it in Russia.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't run. Yeah. So basically, what happened in 1999, there was a series of apartment building bombings in Moscow and a couple of other Russian cities that killed about 400 people, civilians. And this is right when Boris Yeltsin had appointed Putin as his prime minister. Putin came out of the KGB. These apartment building bombings got blamed on Chechen separatists from Chechnya. And Putin used that pretext to start another war in Chechnya and kick the hell out of the place. So he became a national hero for having really put the boot in on Chechnya. And then he was off to the races. That was the beginning of the Putin.
So it was like his Gulf of Tonkin. His
Gulf of Tonkin or his Reichstag fire. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
God, I forgot all of this until we started prepping for this.
Yeah, no, but there were all these stories, rumors floating around that in fact the KGB had manufactured these. They had carried out these bombings as a way to catapult Putin, one of their own, into power. So I went to Russia and I interviewed people, including former KGB officers, who said, yeah, no, this was definitely a KGB operation, and it was done to benefit Putin. The Chechens didn't have anything to do with it. And then when I finished the article and handed it into GQ, the lawyers at Condé Nast got in the act, and I think they were frightened that all the Condé Nast publications they have in Russia were going to be shut down. So the lawyers basically they first tried to kill the article outright, but the editors at GQ, to their credit, threatened to quit if they wouldn't run it. But then they did everything possible to just bury it. There was no mention on the cover of GQ that this article was inside. They wouldn't sell it to any Condé Nast publications anywhere in Europe. That issue did not. There's a GQ in Russia. That issue didn't come out that month in Russia.
So what you're saying is if they had given that article better play, maybe we wouldn't have Trump as president right now?
Maybe.
Like if we could have torpedoed Putin early on, he wouldn't have gotten this guy elected in our country?
Maybe. Well, but I mean, I don't know, because I mean, there's a lot of things that happened since then. And Trump was kind of sucking up to Putin all along. It didn't seem to have much effect in 2016.
Scott, There's Andrew, who we're about to interview. I don't know if he popped up on the video or not, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We'd like to remind our listeners to go out and pick up a copy of The Quiet Americans, and it is great to see you.
Thanks, Whit. Great to see you too.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Yeah, my pleasure.